It was late when Henry stumbled into the hotel, weary from his long drive. The neon sign outside flickered vacancy, buzzing faintly in the cold night air. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up, handing him the key to room 213 with a muttered warning about the radiator acting up. Henry didn't care. He just needed a bed and some sleep. The room was unimpressive but functional. A lumpy queen-size bed, a small desk, and a single window with heavy drapes that didn't quite meet in the middle. He tossed his duffel bag onto the bed, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress with a groan. As he closed his eyes, the faint grinding sound began. At first, he thought it was the radiator. The clerk had warned him, after all. But as the minutes passed, the sound persisted, low and mechanical, like metal scraping against stone. It seemed to be coming from beneath the bed. Henry froze, suddenly wide awake. He sat up, the mattress creaking under his weight, and listened intently. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. His heart quickened. It was probably just the building settling, he told himself, though the excuse felt hollow. The noise grew louder, more insistent, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Taking a deep breath, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and knelt down, peering into the shadows beneath. The dim light from the bedside lamp barely penetrated the darkness, but he could make out the outline of something metallic. It gleamed faintly, and the grinding grew louder, as if it had sensed his presence. A cold shiver ran down his spine. "Hello?" he whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. The sound abruptly stopped. Silence pressed down on him, heavy and unnatural. Then, with a sudden, jarring motion, the bed frame jolted upward, slamming back down hard enough to make the floorboards creak. Henry scrambled back, heart pounding. Something was under there. Something alive. He grabbed the desk chair, holding it like a makeshift weapon, and edged toward the door. His hands fumbled for the lock, but it wouldn't turn. The knob wouldn't budge either. Panic set in as he yanked on the door, but it was as if it had been welded shut. He turned back toward the bed, the chair trembling in his grip. The grinding noise returned, louder now, accompanied by a wet, slithering sound. Henry backed away, pressing himself against the door. The bed began to shake violently, the frame rattling against the floor. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from underneath. It was a hand, or at least something shaped like a hand. Long, skeletal fingers clawed at the floor, pulling a twisted, malformed body into view. Its head was misshapen, with too many eyes glinting in the dim light, each one staring directly at Henry. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that ground together in that same terrible sound he'd heard before. Henry screamed, swinging the chair wildly as the thing lunged toward him. The legs of the chair splintered on impact, but the creature barely flinched. It moved with impossible speed, slamming into him and knocking him to the ground. Its touch was icy, and the grinding noise filled his ears, louder and louder, until it was all he could hear. Desperate, Henry crawled toward the window, clawing at the drapes. He yanked them aside, only to find the glass wasn't there. Instead, the window frame opened onto a vast, endless void, black and shimmering, as though the night sky itself had been torn open. A strange wind pulled at him, tugging him toward the emptiness. The creature was behind him, its skeletal fingers wrapping around his ankle. He kicked and screamed, but its grip was unrelenting. The grinding noise grew deafening, a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The room was shifting, the walls bending and stretching as though they were alive. The door melted into the wall, leaving no escape. With one final desperate burst of strength, Henry twisted free of the creature's grip and dove toward the void. He had no other choice. The blackness swallowed him whole, and for a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of time or place. Then, slowly, a new sound emerged, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Henry opened his eyes. He was back in the hotel lobby, standing in front of the desk. The clerk was there, smiling faintly, as if nothing had happened. "Rough night?" the clerk asked, his tone almost mocking. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his body trembling. He glanced down at his hands and saw faint scratches, as though he'd been clawing at something. "Room 213, the clerk said, sliding the key across the desk. "Enjoy your stay." Henry stumbled backward, the world spinning around him. The grinding noise started again, faint and distant, as if calling to him. He turned and ran out of the hotel, into the cold night, vowing never to look back. But as he drove away, the sound followed him, whispering in the dark corners of his mind, promising that it wasn't over. Not yet. It was a last-minute decision to stay at the Blackwood Hotel. My car had broken down on a desolate stretch of highway, and the storm clouds rolling in made hitchhiking seem like a death wish. The flickering neon sign promising vacancies felt like salvation, even if the building itself gave off an unsettling vibe. The hotel was perched awkwardly on the edge of Blackwood Hill, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to stretch toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I stepped into the lobby, shaking off the rain. The air inside was thick, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic I couldn't place. Behind the front desk stood a woman who seemed frozen in time. Her beehive hairdo and thick eyeliner screamed the 1960s. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Blackwood Hotel," she said in a monotone voice. "You're just in time. A room's ready for you." The key she handed me was attached to an ornate brass tag engraved with the number 13. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should request a different room, but I was too tired to argue. As I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, the wallpaper seemed to shift under the light, almost like it was breathing. The floor creaked under my boots, the sound echoing like a whisper down the corridor. Room 13 was at the end of the hall. The brass key slid into the lock with an unsettling ease, and the door groaned as it swung open. Inside, the room was unremarkable too. Unremarkable. The furniture looked like it had been plucked from a thrift store clearance bin. A scratched wooden dresser, a moth-eaten armchair, and a bed covered in a faded floral quilt. The walls were bare except for a single crooked painting of a field under a blood-red sky. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, the mattress emitting a low, guttural squeak. That's when I noticed it. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly. My breath fogged in the air despite the heater humming in the corner. I told myself it was just an old building with poor insulation, but the rationalization did little to ease the chill creeping up my spine. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. The dresser drawers were lined with yellowed newspaper clippings. At first, I dismissed them as padding, but curiosity got the better of me. Each article detailed grisly murders or strange disappearances. One headline read, "Man found in room 13 with eyes missing." Another described a couple who vanished without a trace, their belongings left behind as if they had simply stepped out for air and never returned. Unease bubbled in my stomach, but I forced myself to laugh it off. "Urban legends," I muttered, shoving the clippings back into the drawer. But deep down, I didn't believe my own words. As night fell, the storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the walls. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to sleep. That's when I heard a soft knock on the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the front desk hadn't mentioned other guests. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The knocking stopped. I waited a moment, then got up, peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, I crawled back into bed. But as I pulled the quilt up to my chin, the knocking started again, this time louder and more insistent. I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned on the lamp by the bedside table and waited, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The knocking continued for what felt like hours before abruptly stopping. Silence blanketed the room, and for a brief moment, I thought it was over. That's when I saw it. The painting on the wallet had changed. The once barren field in the painting now featured a figure standing in the distance. It was small and indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled to the dresser and yanked the drawer open, searching for the newspapers. I needed answers, something to explain what was happening. Before I could sift through them, the lamp flickered and the room plunged into darkness. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the blackness, but in its dim glow, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from the painting was no longer confined to the canvas. It stood at the foot of the bed, its hollow eyes staring right at me. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The figure at the foot of the bed was barely illuminated by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight, but its outline was unmistakably a gaunt, shadowy form draped in tattered cloth. Its face nothing more than two empty voids where eyes should have been. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were filled with lead. Then, as if to mock my fear, the thing tilted its head slightly, the motion unnervingly slow and deliberate. It took a step closer, and the floorboards groaned beneath its weight. I scrambled backward on the bed, dropping my phone in the process. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, or so it seemed. I could feel it, though that oppressive presence lingering in the air like smoke. I snatched up my phone and shone the flashlight around the room, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm outside. The painting was back to normal, the figure gone from the canvas. But the unease lingered, sharp and unrelenting. I didn't want to stay in the room a second longer. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The hallway was as dark as the room, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. The wallpaper seemed to ripple like water, and I could swear I heard whispers coming from the wall, soft, unintelligible murmurs that grew louder with each step I took. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the doors on either side identical and unmarked. I passed room after room, but no matter how far I ran, the layout of the hotel seemed to loop back on itself. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They didn't match mine. They were slower, heavier, deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hallway behind me was empty. Still, the sound persisted, growing closer with every passing second. Panic surged through me and I broke into a sprint. The hallway seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing as if the building itself were alive and trying to trap me. I rounded a corner and came to a stairwell. The dim emergency light above it flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. Without hesitation, I descended the stairs 2 at a time, the sound of the footsteps still trailing me. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a basement that shouldn't have existed. The space was cavernous and eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Rusted pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed in the stillness. At the far end of the room was an old wooden door, its surface covered in deep scratches. I didn't want to go near it, but the sound of the footsteps descending the stairs left me no choice. I pushed the door open and stepped into a corridor lined with flickering candles. The walls were stone, cold and damp to the touch, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. My head throbbed and I had to fight the urge to cover my ears. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one made of iron and covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the candlelight. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I knew there was no going back. The footsteps were right behind me now, slow and deliberate. Whatever was chasing me wanted me to open the door. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The room beyond was enormous, far larger than it should have been, given the hotel's exterior. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not just me but countless other figures, shadowy and distorted. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat a small black box. The whispers grew deafening, their chaotic words coalescing into a single command: open it. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed that opening the box would unleash something terrible, something that couldn't be undone. But my hands moved on their own, drawn to the box as if by an invisible force. The moment my fingers touched it, the mirrors shattered simultaneously, the sound like 1,000 screams. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard a voice, deep and guttural, speaking directly into my mind. You should not have come here. A blinding light erupted from the box, and I felt myself being pulled, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around me. The air grew cold, and my vision blurred, the world around me twisting and distorting. When the light faded, I was no longer in the hotel. I was back in my car, parked on the side of the road where it had broken down. The storm was gone, the sky clear and dotted with stars. My heart raced as I looked around, the memory of what had just happened seared into my mind. My bag was in the passenger seat, and the key to room 13 sat on the dashboard. But something was wrong. My reflection in the rearview mirror wasn't mine. It smiled. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, wrapping the mountains in a suffocating blanket of white. Mia and Ethan were young, adventurous, and hopelessly unprepared. Their compact car, laden with backpacks and snacks, barely crawled along the icy road when Mia spotted the glowing neon sign ahead, Blackridge Inn. It flickered faintly, its letters half burned out, but it promised shelter. Desperation won over caution, and they pulled into the small gravel driveway. The inn loomed ahead, a hulking shadow of mismatched architecture. Its wooden exterior was warped and faded, and the window stall and narrow seemed to watch them as they approached. Inside, the air was thick and warm, carrying a faint scent of mothballs and mildew. The lobby was cramped, dimly lit by a single chandelier that dangled precariously. A woman in her 60s stood behind the front desk, her gaze piercing and unblinking. Her name tag read Eleanor. "You're lucky you found us," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "Storm like this, there's no telling when the roads will clear. Got one room left top floor. Beautiful view of the mountains." Ethan hesitated, but Mia nudged him, eager to get out of the cold. They paid in cash. Eleanor insisted and were handed an old-fashioned brass key with a number etched into it, room 313. The elevator was out of order, so they climbed the creaking staircase to the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with peeling wallpaper and dim, flickering sconces. Dominated the space, its dark wood frame carved with intricate floral patterns. A vanity with an oval mirror sat against one wall, and heavy crimson curtains hung over the windows. The air felt still, as if it had been undisturbed for years. "It's cozy," Mia said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan dropped their bags by the door and flopped onto the bed. "I'll take anything over that storm, this'll do." Mia wandered over to the vanity and inspected the mirror. Its surface was slightly tarnished, with faint scratches that spiderwebbed across the glass. As she stared at her reflection, she felt a faint unease she couldn't quite place. The image looking back at her felt wrong. But she shook off the feeling and joined Ethan on the bed, curling up under the thick quilt. They woke early the next morning, sunlight struggling to pierce through the heavy curtains. The storm had subsided, but the world outside remained eerily silent, muffled by the thick layer of snow. Mia headed to the bathroom to freshen up, while Ethan rummaged through his bag for breakfast snacks. The bathroom was small but functional. A clawfoot tub sat in the corner, and the sink's porcelain basin was cracked but clean. As Mia washed her face, she glanced up at the mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back, as it should. But as she reached for a towel, she caught something off. Her reflection hadn't moved. Her hand in the mirror still rested on the faucet, even though she'd already pulled it away. She froze, staring at the glass. The reflection hesitated, then slowly followed her movement, as if lagging behind. Mia's stomach churned. "Ethan?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Yeah?" he answered from the other room, oblivious. She didn't respond. Instead, she leaned closer to the mirror, her breath fogging the glass. The reflection leaned closer too, but there was something off about its eyes. They were duller, almost lifeless. She raised a hand to touch the mirror, but the instant her fingers brushed the glass, her reflection froze completely, its hand still midair. Mia stumbled back, knocking over a soap dish. Her heart raced as she backed out of the bathroom. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, looking up from the bed. "Yeah, fine," she lied, trying to steady her voice. "Just thought I saw a spider." The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. They decided to explore the inner at least, Mia insisted. She didn't want to be alone in the room. The corridors were eerily quiet, their footsteps muffled by threadbare carpeting. Most of the doors were locked, but own room 307 was slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open, revealing a room identical to theirs, but the bed was stripped, and the mirror above the vanity was shattered. "Weird," Ethan muttered. "Guess they're remodeling?" Mia didn't reply. She felt the air shift, a sudden chill that made her shiver. She swore she heard faint whispers, but Ethan seemed oblivious. He tugged her hand, leading her back to their room. As they passed the front desk, Eleanor appeared from nowhere, startling them both. Her eyes locked onto Mia. "You slept well?" she asked, her tone too pleasant to be genuine. Yeah," Ethan replied. "Thanks." Eleanor's gaze lingered on Mia for a moment too long. "Good. That room, it's special." "What do you mean?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Eleanor just smiled and turned away, disappearing into a back room. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. Ethan snored softly beside her, but her mind was consumed by the mirror. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, until she couldn't take it anymore. She slipped out of bed and approached the vanity. The room was bathed in shadows, but moonlight filtered through a crack in the curtains, illuminating the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly still. Even as Mia moved closer, the image remained frozen. Her breath hitched as the reflection's lips curled into a faint smile. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. When she blinked, the reflection was normal again, mimicking her terrified expression. A loud knock echoed through the room, making her jump. She spun around, but the door was closed, and Ethan hadn't stirred. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't the door, it was coming from the mirror. Her reflection leaned closer, its face pressing against the glass from the inside. The knock turned into a deafening pounding, and Mia clutched her ears, unable to move. The mirror began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across the surface as the reflection grinned wider, its teeth unnaturally sharp. Ethan bolted upright. "Mia? What's going on?" Before she could answer, the mirror shattered, shards flying across the room. But when Ethan turned on the light, the mirror was intact, not a single crack in sight. In what she'd just seen. "I think we need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. Ethan frowned, but nodded, sensing her fear. First thing in the morning. But deep down, Mia knew the inn wouldn't let them go so easily. The morning light barely pierced the thick crimson curtains, casting the room in an eerie twilight. Mia sat upright on the bed, clutching her knees to her chest. She hadn't slept a wink. Ethan snored softly beside her, blissfully unaware of the horrors she had witnessed. Her eyes kept darting to the mirror above the vanity, its surface now pristine but holding an ominous presence. She nudged Ethan awake. "Ethan, we need to go. Now." He groaned, rubbing his face. "Mia, it's barely morning. The roads are probably still bad. Can't we wait a few more hours?" "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here another minute." The urgency in her tone finally broke through his sleepiness. Ethan sat up, his brow furrowed. All right, let's pack up." They hurriedly gathered their belongings, and within minutes, they were ready to leave. As Ethan opened the door, a blast of cold air greeted them. The hallway was eerily silent, the flickering sconces casting long shadows. Mia's heart raced as they made their way to the staircase, every creak of the wooden floorboards sending chills down her spine. When they reached the lobby, Eleanor was there, standing behind the desk as if she had been waiting for them. Her expression was inscrutable, her eyes fixed on Mia. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her tone laced with something that made Mia's skin crawl. "Yeah," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks for the room, but we've got to hit the road." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. Storms cleared up, but the mountain can be unpredictable. Roads might not be safe yet. "We'll take our chances," Mia interjected, her voice sharper than she intended. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the door. "Safe travels," Eleanor called after them, her voice echoing in the empty lobby. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a wall. Their car was buried under a thick layer of snow. Ethan sighed and began brushing it off with his gloved hands, while Mia scanned the inn's windows. She felt like she was being watched, but every window seemed empty. Yet the unease didn't leave her. Finally, the car was clear enough to drive. Ethan turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. They pulled out of the driveway and onto the winding mountain road. The snow-covered landscape was hauntingly beautiful, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being followed. They had been driving for about 20 minutes when Ethan spoke. "You're awfully quiet. Want to tell me what's going on?" Mia hesitated. She knew how ridiculous it would sound, but she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. "The mirror," she began. Something wasn't right with it. My reflection, it moved on its own. It smiled at me, Ethan. It pounded on the glass." He glanced at her, concern etched on his face. "Mia, are you sure you weren't just dreaming?" "I wasn't dreaming," she snapped. "It was real. And Eleanor, she knows something. She's hiding something." Ethan sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "All right, I believe you. Let's just get as far away from that place as we can." The road wound through dense forest, the trees forming a tunnel of skeletal branches. The snow on the road grew thicker, and the car's tires began to slip. Ethan slowed down, his jaw tight with concentration. That's when Mia saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. "Ethan, stop!" she screamed. He slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt, the tires kicking up a spray of snow. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face, obscuring her features. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps. "Don't get out," she whispered. But Ethan was already opening his door. "She might be hurt." "Ethan, no," Mia pleaded, grabbing his arm. But he shook her off and stepped out into the snow. "Miss, are you okay?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. The woman didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to one side. Ethan took a cautious step toward her. That's when she moved. Her head snapped up, revealing hollow black pits where her eyes should have been. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She let out a guttural, inhuman scream that pierced the silence. Ethan stumbled backward, scrambling to get back to the car. The woman, if it could even be called that, lunged forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "Drive, drive," Ethan shouted as he slammed the door shut. Mia didn't need to be told twice. She threw the car into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching traction, and they sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, Mia saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching them. But then, impossibly, it began to run after them, its limbs flailing in grotesque angles. It moved faster than any human should be able to. "It's still coming," she cried, her voice breaking. "Go faster," Ethan yelled, gripping the dashboard. The car roared as it picked up speed, the engine straining against the incline of the mountain road. The figure fell further behind, but Mia didn't slow down until it was completely out of sight. Hours later, they reached the nearest town. They pulled into a gas station, their nerves frayed and their faces pale. Inside, the clerk greeted them cheerfully, but his expression changed when Mia mentioned the Blackridge Inn. "That place burned down years ago," he said, his voice hushed. "No one's been up there since." Mia felt the blood drain from her face. That can't be right. We were just there. The clerk shook his head. If you stayed there, you weren't alone. The campfires had long burned out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. A chorus of crickets filled the heavy night air as the campers lay in their bunks, but not everyone was asleep. In Cabin B, a group of boys whispered under the cover of their blankets, flashlights illuminating their eager faces. House 13 isn't even that creepy, scoffed Jake, the self-proclaimed bravest of the group. It's just a dumb old house. Yeah, replied Eric, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Then why do the counselors always act so weird when anyone mentions it? And what about the story? The guy who went in and never came back out? It's just a story to scare kids like you, Jake retorted. But if you're too chicken to prove it, I'm not chicken, Eric shot back. Let's go tonight, all of us. The others hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. House 13 had been forbidden territory for decades. Nestled at the edge of the forest, its broken windows and sagging roof were enough to unnerve anyone. But the real fear came from the rumors. They said a man had died there, alone and angry, and his spirit lingered, cursing anyone who dared step inside. All right, Jake said finally, a smirk on his face. Midnight. Don't wuss out. The clock in the mess hall struck 12 as the boys crept through the shadows, their flashlights bouncing faintly off the trees. Eric, Jake, Ben, and Thomas stopped at the edge of the clearing, where House 13 stood like a rotting corpse. The air here was colder, unnaturally so, and the chirping of the crickets had gone eerily silent. It's just a house, Jake said again, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The porch creaked ominously as they climbed the steps, their sneakers stirring up decades of dust. The door, its paint peeling in jagged strips, groaned as Jake pushed it open. The smell hit them first, damp wood, mildew, and something metallic like rust, but sharper. This is stupid, Ben muttered, his eyes darting around the dim entryway. Let's just take a picture and go. What, scared already? Jake teased, though his hand trembled as he held his flashlight. Come on, let's look around. The floorboards protested under their weight as they ventured deeper into the house. Faded wallpaper hung in shreds, and furniture lay toppled and broken. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every sound, every step, every creak seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. What's that? Eric whispered, pointing to a dark stain on the floor. It spread out in jagged lines, soaked deep into the wood. It's just water damage, Jake said, but his voice cracked. Looks like blood, Thomas murmured, his face pale. Old blood. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs. All four boys froze, their breath caught in their throats. They stared at the ceiling, where the sound seemed to echo endlessly. It's probably just the wind, Jake said, though his voice was barely audible. Or like a raccoon or something. We should leave, Ben said firmly, already backing toward the door. But Jake shook his head. No way. We came here to prove there's nothing to be scared of. Let's check it out. Against their better judgment, the group ascended the staircase, each step groaning under their weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, cloaked in shadows. A faint, noisy, rhythmic tapping came from the far end. Who's there? Jake called, his voice shaky. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Maybe it's... Eric began, but the words died in his throat as the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang. Run! Ben yelled, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as they turned to flee. Their flashlights flickered, and the air grew icy. The walls appeared to ripple, the peeling wallpaper twisting into grotesque shapes. Eric tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering across the floor. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through him, stood at the end of the hall. "Go!" Jake shouted, pulling Eric to his feet. They barreled down the stairs, the figure's footsteps echoing behind them, though none of them dared to look back. The front door slammed shut just as they reached it. Ben screamed, pounding on the wood, but it wouldn't budge. "The window!" Thomas yelled, pointing to the shattered pane beside the door. One by one, they scrambled through, cutting their hands and arms on the jagged glass. The moment their feet hit the ground, the house let out a deep, guttural groan, as if it were alive. They ran without looking back, the air around them filled with whispers and faint laughter. When they finally reached the safety of their cabin, they bolted the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. At the end of the hall, its hollow eyes and twisted grin. The next morning, the counselors found them huddled together, pale and shaken. When asked what happened, they said nothing. But when they passed House 13 later that day, they noticed something new. The door was open, swinging gently in the breeze, and in the dust on the porch, a single word was scrawled in jagged letters: "Stay." The fire crackled softly in the center of the clearing, throwing flickering shadows across the circle of tents. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, just 6 friends out in the woods, reconnecting with nature. But from the moment we arrived at Camp Hollow Pines, something felt off. The place had been abandoned for years. Rusted swings creaked in the faint breeze, and the skeletal remains of a lodge stood at the heart of the camp. The trees seemed unnaturally dense, their branches clawing at the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. It wasn't the serene escape I'd imagined. Instead, it felt like we'd stepped into another world, one where something ancient and malevolent waited. We tried to shake off the unease as we set up camp. Sarah and Mike joked about ghost stories while unpacking supplies. Jess and Alex wandered off to explore the dilapidated lodge, laughing nervously as the creaking door swallowed them. Only Ethan seemed to share my unease. He kept glancing toward the tree line, his brow furrowed as though he expected something to emerge from the shadows. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, an oppressive silence had fallen over the camp. Even the usual forest sound, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. It was as though the woods were holding their breath. "All right, who's got the best scary story?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence as we gathered around the fire. She was trying to lighten the mood, but her voice wavered slightly. Mike launched into a tale about a phantom hitchhiker, his voice low and theatrical. The story should have been cheesy, but every snap of a twig in the darkness made us jump. When he finished, laughter erupted, too loud, too forced. It was like we were all trying to drown out the unease that had settled over us. Jess and Alex still hadn't returned from the lodge, but no one seemed eager to go looking for them. Instead, we sat in tense silence, staring into the fire. Minutes dragged by, stretching into an hour. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to suggest we check on them, a piercing scream shattered the stillness. It came from the direction of the lodge. We bolted to our feet, adrenaline surging as we grabbed flashlights and ran toward the sound. The old wooden building loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eye sockets. The door creaked open with a groan as we stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Our flashlight beams danced across broken furniture and graffiti-scrawled walls. "Jess? Alex?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. A faint, rustling sound came from upstairs. We exchanged uneasy glances before heading up the rickety staircase. The second floor was even darker, the only light coming from our flashlights. The rustling grew louder as we approached a door at the end of the hall. Ethan pushed it open, and our beams swept across the room. It was empty, save for a broken desk and a shattered window. But the rustling hadn't stopped. It was coming from the corner, where a pile of torn fabric and debris lay. Slowly, I stepped closer and prodded it with my foot. A raccoon darted out, its eyes glowing eerily in the flashlight beams. We all let out shaky laughs, relief washing over use until we noticed the blood. To the shattered window. "What the hell?" Mike whispered. They must have fallen. Sarah stammered, though her tone betrayed doubt. We rushed to the window and looked down. The ground was far below, and the forest stretched out in every direction. But there was no sign of Jess or Alex, just the blood trail, disappearing into the woods. "We have to go after them," Ethan said firmly, already heading downstairs. The rest of us hesitated, but we couldn't just leave our friends. Grabbing a lantern, we followed him into the night. The forest was suffocatingly dark. Our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, and every step seemed to amplify the silence. The blood trail was faint but visible, winding through the trees. As we walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows shifted at the edge of our vision, but when we turned, there was nothing there. "This is insane," Sarah muttered. "We should go back and call for help." "There's no signal out here," Ethan replied grimly, "and we can't just leave them." We pushed on, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The blood trail ended abruptly at a clearing, where the ground was littered with strange symbols carved into the dirt. In the center stood a totem made of twisted branches and bones, its surface glistening with fresh blood. "What the hell is that?" Mike breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw eyes, dozens of them, gleaming in the darkness. Look out. I saw claws, teeth, and glinting eyes as screams filled the air. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my skin as I plunged into the woods. Behind me, the others were shouting, but their voices were drowned out by the guttural snarls of whatever was chasing us. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning as terror drove me forward. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing and collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the faint moonlight, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side as it watched me, unblinking. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped forward, and I realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding me in a tightening circle. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was their faces twisted, hollow, and impossibly familiar. Jess and Alex were among them. It began with a suffocating silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes the world feel wrong. Camp Whispering Pines had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, its cabins sinking into decay, the surrounding forest reclaiming its territory. The tragedy of 2007 hung over it like a curse. 8 teenagers had vanished during a midnight hike, leaving behind nothing but rumors of foul play and whispers of something darker. The camp's gates were locked, and its legacy became a horror story told to frighten children. But time has a way of dulling even the sharpest horrors. By 2025, a new owner had decided to reopen Camp Whispering Pines. With glossy brochures and cheerful social media posts, they promised to bring life back to the camp. A fresh start, they said. The past was just that. The first few days were uneventful. The counselors, mostly college students eager for an easy summer, job-busied themselves preparing activities and getting to know the campers. The woods felt alive, the lake shimmered, and the air carried the sweet scent of pine. Even the local legends seemed to lose their bite in the sunlight. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp changed. On the second night, during the evening bonfire, a small girl named Emily asked a question that sent a chill through the counselors. "Who's that man in the woods?" she asked, pointing to the tree line. The counselors exchanged uneasy glances but saw nothing. "Just shadows," they told her. "It's nothing." But the unease lingered long after the flames died down. Later that night, as the campers slept, a heavy fog rolled in. It crept through the cabins and coiled around the trees, thick and unnatural. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, the distant rustling of leaf shad vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Lily, the head counselor, was making her rounds when she heard it. A faint, sibilant whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Turning her flashlight toward the woods, she caught a glimpse of a figure tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the fog. Her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. When it came back on, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The next morning, Lily told the others what she had seen. Most dismissed it as a trick of the fog, but Ben, a history major and self-proclaimed skeptic, looked uneasy. He had spent time researching the camp's history and knew details the others didn't. "The night those kids disappeared," he said, "there were reports of strange lights in the sky. Animals were found dead, their bodies twisted like something had played with them. That evening, the fog returned, thicker than before. It swallowed the lake, the trees, and the cabins, muffling sound and distorting light. During a head count, the counselors discovered one camper missing, Max, a quiet boy who loved exploring. They split into pairs and began searching, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the fog. Ben and Rachel found Max standing by the lake, his back to them, staring into the water. His body was rigid, and his head tilted unnaturally to one side. When they called his name, he didn't respond. As they approached, they saw something floating near him, a crude, human-shaped figure made of sticks, bound with red string. Carved symbols adorned its surface, and a faint, low hum seemed to emanate from it. "Max," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "Come back to the cabin." Max turned slowly, his eyes blank and unseeing. His lips moved, forming words they couldn't hear. Then, as if waking from a trance, he gasped and collapsed into their arms. "They're coming," he mumbled. "They're already here." Over the next few days, the camp descended into chaos. Strange symbols began appearing on the cabin walls, carved deep into the wood. Supplies vanished, only to reappear in grotesque arrangements. A pile of shoes stacked in a pyramid, or a circle of flashlights pointing toward the sky. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the figures in the fog became bolder, their shapes lingering at the edge of vision. The counselors tried to maintain order, but fear had taken hold. Emily, the girl who first noticed the figure in the woods, began drawing pictures of the shadowy forms. In each one, they were closer to the cabins. The breaking point came during a camp-wide game of hide-and-seek. When the game ended, one camper, a boy named Jordan, was missing. The search led them deep into the woods, where they found him crouched beneath a tree, his fingers clawing at the dirt. His nails were bloody, his face streaked with tears. "They're under us," he sobbed. "They've always been under us." That night, the counselors decided to evacuate. They loaded the children onto buses, desperate to leave before whatever haunted the camp could strike again. But as the buses pulled away, the fog thickened, swallowing the vehicles whole. The engines sputtered and died, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms impossibly tall and angular, their eyes glowing faintly. The counselors formed a protective circle around the campers, but it was hopeless. The figures moved closer, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. By dawn, the buses were found abandoned at the edge of the woods, their interiors marked with symbols carved deep into the seats and walls. No trace of the campers or counselors remained. Camp Whispering Pines was sealed off, left to rot under the weight of its horrors. Locals say the forest is cursed, that the whispers can still be heard on foggy nights. Some claim to see shadowy figures watching from the trees, waiting for the camp to open once more. The summer camp was nestled deep in the forest, a secluded place where towering pines swayed in the wind, and the stars lit up the night like a million tiny lanterns. A vast lake stretched across the camp's edge, shimmering by day but turning pitch black by night. The kids loved the water. They'd spend hours splashing, diving, and paddling canoes under the watchful eyes of the counselors. But as the sun dipped below the treetops, the lake's allure twisted into something darker. The counselors had one unshakable rule: no one was allowed near the water after sunset. The warnings were stern, though the reasoning was vague. Some counselors hinted at strong currents that became dangerous at night. Others claimed it was simply to ensure safety in the dark. But the older kids whispered of stranger things-old camp legends about the lake being cursed. It was said that on moonless nights, eerie wails could be heard drifting across the water, and shadows moved beneath its surface, though no one was swimming. Ryan was 16 and spending his 5th summer at the camp. Tall, athletic, and known for his daredevil attitude, he dismissed the stories as nonsense meant to scare the younger kids. He'd never heard the wails himself, though some of his cabin mates swore they had. To Ryan, the lake was just a lake, and rules were meant to be broken. One humid July evening, the counselors called lights out after a long day of activities. The camp settled into an uneasy quiet. The only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ryan lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wide awake. His cabin mates had already drifted off, their snores filling the room. Then faintly he heard it, a soft, high-pitched sound, almost like a child crying. He sat up, his heart beating a little faster. The sound was coming from outside, faint but unmistakable. He crept to the window and peered out into the night. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over the camp. Beyond the cabins, the lake lay still, a vast black mirror. The crying sound came again, clearer this time, and it seemed to be coming from the water's edge. Ryan's curiosity flared. Maybe one of the younger kids had wandered off and gotten lost. He slipped on his sneakers, grabbed his flashlight, and carefully opened the cabin door. The cool night air prickled his skin as he stepped outside, his steps cautious and quiet on the gravel path. The camp seemed deserted, every cabin dark and silent. As he approached the lake, the crying grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't the sound of someone sobbing, it was sharp, almost like a wail, and it sent shivers down his spine. He paused at the tree line, scanning the shoreline with his flashlight. The beam of light danced over the still water and the tall reeds at the edge, but there was no one there. "Hello?" Ryan called out, his voice trembling despite himself. "Is anyone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. Ryan's pulse quickened. He took a hesitant step forward, his sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. The air felt heavier now, as though the atmosphere itself were pressing down on him. Suddenly, there was a splash. Not a small ripple, but a loud, forceful splash, like something heavy had been thrown into the water. Ryan whipped his flashlight toward the lake, the beam quivering as his hand shook. The water's surface was rippling violently, though he could see no source for the disturbance. "Who's out there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. There was no reply, just the eerie sound of the ripples lapping against the shore. He scanned the area again, feeling the hairs on his arms stand on end. Then he noticed something. Just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam, a figure stood knee-deep in the water. It was barely visible, a dark silhouette that seemed unnaturally still. "Hey!" Ryan shouted, his fear giving way to a burst of anger. "What are you doing out there? It's not safe!" The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to acknowledge him. Ryan hesitated, debating whether to approach or retreat. Then the figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and as it came closer, Ryan's flashlight illuminated its face. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was a boy, no older than 10, but his face was pale and sunken, his eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Water dripped from his soaked clothes, but there was no sound of splashing as he moved. The boy opened his mouth, but no words came out, only that same high-pitched wail Ryan had heard earlier. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled, casting wild, erratic beams across the lake. When he looked back, the boy was gone. The water was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Ryan didn't wait to see if the figure would reappear. He turned and sprinted back toward the cabins, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. As he ran, he could swear he heard footsteps behind him, wet and slapping against the ground. But when he glanced back, the path was empty. He burst into his cabin, slamming the door behind him and waking his bunkmates. "What the hell, man?" one of them groaned, rubbing his eyes. Ryan didn't answer. He just stood there, trembling, his back pressed against the door. Whatever he had seen, whatever had been out there by the lake, he knew one thing for certain. The counselor's warnings weren't just campfire tales. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. The next morning, Ryan was silent at breakfast, pushing his scrambled eggs around on his plate, while the other campers laughed and chatted. The bright sunlight streaming through the windows felt alien, too cheerful to belong to the same world as the horrifying events of the previous night. Ryan's bunkmate, Luke, nudged him with an elbow. "You all right, man? You look like you saw a ghost." Ryan froze for a second, then forced a laugh. "Just didn't sleep well," he muttered, avoiding Luke's eyes. What he thought he'd seen. The day dragged on, and Ryan found himself glancing toward the lake every chance he got. The water sparkled innocently under the sun, but he couldn't shake the image of the boy's pale, sunken face. By the time evening rolled around, his nerves were frayed. The counselors announced a campfire by the lake, complete with s'mores and ghost stories. Ryan felt his stomach twist. The last place he wanted to be was near that water, especially after dark. Still, he didn't want to draw attention to himself by skipping out. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the campers gathered around the roaring fire, Ryan sat on the edge of the group, his eyes darting between the flickering flames and the black expanse of the lake beyond. The counselors took turns telling spooky stories, their voices rising and falling dramatically as the kids leaned in, wide-eyed. But Ryan barely heard them. His focus was on the water, which seemed impossibly still. Then he saw it. A ripple, faint but unmistakable, disturbed the lake's surface. His breath caught, and he stared, willing it to stop. But the ripples grew, spreading outward as if something were moving just beneath the surface. Ryan's pulse raced. He glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. "Ryan," one of the counselors called, snapping him out of his trance. "You look like you've got a story to share. Want to tell us something spooky?" Ryan opened his mouth to decline, but before he could speak, a scream tore through the night. It wasn't from the campers, it came from the lake. The same high-pitched wail he'd heard the night before. "Campfire forgotten. What was that?" someone whispered. The counselors exchanged uneasy looks. "Probably an animal," one of them said quickly, but their voice lacked conviction. The wail came again, louder this time, and the campers huddled closer together. Ryan stood up, his heart pounding. He couldn't just sit there. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. Ignoring the shouts of the counselors, he grabbed a flashlight and started toward the lake. "Ryan, stop!" one of them yelled, but he didn't listen. He had to know what was causing the sound. As he reached the shore, the wailing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The flashlight beam danced across the water, but it revealed nothing unusual. Ryan stepped closer, the cold water lapping at his sneakers. He took a deep breath and shone the light farther out. Then, without warning, a hand shot up from the water. It was pale and skeletal, its fingers twisted unnaturally. Ryan stumbled back with a cry, tripping over a rock and landing hard on the ground. The hand disappeared beneath the surface, leaving the water eerily calm once more. The campers and counselors were rushing toward him now, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. "Ryan, are you okay?" Luke shouted, kneeling beside him. Ryan could only nod, his eyes fixed on the lake. Whatever was in there, it wasn't finished, and neither was he. Over the next few days, the camp was on edge. The counselors tried to brush off the events as a mix of imagination and coincidence, but whispers spread among the campers. Late at night, Ryan would wake up in a cold sweat, certain he could hear faint footsteps outside his cabin or soft ripples on the lake. On his final night at camp, Ryan made a decision. He couldn't leave without answers. Armed with his flashlight and a sense of dread, he snuck out of his cabin, careful not to wake anyone. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chirping of crickets conspicuously absent. As he approached the lake, his footsteps slowed. The water was still, reflecting the faint glow of the crescent moon. Ryan took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he shone the flashlight across the surface. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet lapping of the water against the shore. But then, a figure emerged. It was the boy, his empty eyes locked on Ryan, his pale hand reaching out. Ryan froze, unable to move. The boy's voice echoed in his mind, not spoken but felt a desperate plea. "Help me." Summoning his courage, Ryan stepped forward, the water soaking his shoes. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The boy's form flickered, as if it were a projection struggling to stay visible. "Trapped," the voice echoed again, and Ryan realized the boy wasn't the threat. Something else was. The shadows beneath the lake began to move, dark tendrils rising toward the surface. The boy's eyes widened in fear, and he gestured for Ryan to run. Ryan stumbled back, his heart racing as the tendrils reached for him. He turned and sprinted toward the cabins, the sound of the lake churning behind him. When he reached the safety of his bunk, he collapsed, gasping for breath. The next morning, the lake was gone. The counselors claimed it had always been a dry field, but Ryan knew better. Whatever had happened that summer, whatever force had haunted the lake, it wasn't over. The boy's face lingered in his mind, a silent reminder of the secrets the forest held. And deep down, Ryan knew he would never forget the wail of the lake. Mary loved spending summers at her grandmother's creaky old house. It had towering bookshelves, a garden overrun with wildflowers, and countless nooks to explore. But the attic, the one place her grandmother had always warned her to avoid, was the most alluring mystery of all. One rainy afternoon, while her grandmother dozed in the parlor, Mary found herself unable to resist the attic's pull. Armed with a flashlight and her curiosity, she crept up the narrow stairs. The air grew cooler as she ascended, the scent of dust and mothballs becoming stronger. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The attic was packed with forgotten relics, trunks overflowing with yellowed photographs, broken furniture draped in cobwebs, and stacks of old magazines. Mary wandered through the clutter, her flashlight beam revealing forgotten treasures. As she opened an ornate wooden closet tucked into the far corner, her breath caught. Sitting on the closet shelf was a porcelain doll. It wore a faded blue dress trimmed with lace, and its glassy eyes seemed to follow her every move. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing its cold, smooth surface. Mary picked it up, surprised by how heavy it was. Tucked into the folds of its dress was a small, handwritten note. The ink had smudged over time, but she could still make out the words, "Don't leave me behind." The message sent a shiver down her spine, but she shrugged it off. She decided to take the doll downstairs to show her grandmother, hoping to learn its story. "Oh, Mary, you shouldn't have gone up there," her grandmother said when she saw the doll. Her face turned pale. "That belonged to your great-aunt Margaret. She loved it dearly, but after she passed, strange things started happening." "Strange things? Like what?" Mary asked, clutching the doll tighter. Her grandmother hesitated. "It's probably just old memories playing tricks on me, but perhaps it's best you put it back where you found it." That night, Mary couldn't stop thinking about the doll. She had left it in the closet of the guest room before going to bed, but she felt uneasy, as though unseen eyes were watching her. She pulled the covers tightly around herself and drifted into a restless sleep. A soft thud jolted her awake. She squinted in the moonlight streaming through the window and froze. The doll was sitting on the foot of her bed, its head tilted slightly, as if observing her. Mary's heart raced. She distinctly remembered leaving it in the closet. Summoning her courage, she grabbed the doll and rushed back to the closet. She shoved it inside, slammed the door shut, and bolted it with an old latch she found hanging on the doorframe. She returned to bed, trying to convince herself that she must have brought it out earlier and forgotten. But the unease only grew. As she lay there, she swore she could hear faint whispers, so soft they seemed to dissolve into the darkness. She told herself it was the wind, and eventually fell into a fitful sleep. When morning came, the doll was gone. Mary checked the closet, her heart pounding in her chest. The doll was nowhere to be found, but on the inside of the closet door, something new had appeared. The words, "Are we playing?" were scratched deep into the wood, the jagged lines still fresh. She stumbled back, her stomach twisting with fear. She ran to her grandmother and blurted out what had happened. Her grandmother's expression darkened. "You must have dreamed it," she said, though her voice wavered. "The mind can play cruel tricks. Let's not talk about this anymore." Mary could see the fear in her grandmother's eyes. That night, she locked her bedroom door and kept the lights on. But sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, the faint creak of the floorboards outside her room made her sit up in bed. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound grew louder, deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just beyond her door. The doorknob rattled, and Mary bit back a scream. The rattling stopped, replaced by a soft scraping noise. It sounded like nails dragging across the wood. Then the pacing resumed, retreating back down the hall. The next morning, Mary found faint scratches on her bedroom door. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She demanded answers from her grandmother, who finally relented. "Your great-aunt Margaret loved that doll," her grandmother said, wringing her hands. "But after she died, the doll, it seemed to take on a life of its own. Things would move on their own. Whispers in the night, and the scratches. I thought it was all in my head, but if it's happening again..." Her voice trailed off, and she clasped Mary's hands tightly. "We have to get rid of it." Together, they climbed back into the attic, armed with a heavy sack and a small hammer. Mary's grandmother opened a chest and retrieved a bundle of sage, muttering a prayer under her breath. They searched every corner of the house, but the doll was gone. That night, Mary's dreams were filled with images of the doll. It stood at the foot of her bed, its porcelain face twisted into a mocking grin. Its voice echoed in her mind, soft and sing-song. "Are we playing? Are we playing?" She woke with a start, drenched in sweat. On her nightstand sat the doll, its glassy eyes glinting in the pale light of dawn. The words, "Let's play," were scratched into the surface of the nightstand. In a panic, Mary grabbed the doll and ran outside. Her grandmother met her in the garden, where they built a fire in the pit used for burning old yard waste. They tossed the doll into the flames, watching as its delicate features blackened and cracked. The fire roared unnaturally high, and for a moment, Mary thought she heard faint laughter carried on the wind. The doll but ash. Mary and her grandmother never spoke of the doll again. But every now and then, Mary would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced she could hear the faint creak of tiny footsteps just outside her door. The house was exactly what Daniel had been searching for: spacious, affordable, and secluded. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest, it was the perfect retreat from his chaotic city life. The previous owner had passed away months ago, and the place had remained untouched since. Dust clung to the furniture, cobwebs draped across the corners, and the air was heavy with the scent of neglect. But Daniel saw potential. As he moved from room to room, taking in the creaking floors and peeling wallpaper, he felt oddly at ease. It was an old house, sure, but it had character. That was until he found the cabinet, tucked away in the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of rusted tools and paint cans. It stood like a forgotten sentinel. The cabinet was tall and ornate, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe under the dim light. 3 of its 4 doors opened with ease, revealing shelves lined with dust and cobwebs. But the 4th door, smaller than the rest, was locked. Daniel's curiosity flared. He searched the basement for a key but found nothing. The lock itself was strangely dark, brass mechanism that seemed older than the house itself. Frustrated, he decided to force it open. Grabbing a crowbar, he wedged it into the gap and applied pressure. The cabinet groaned, the wood creaking under the strain. Then, just as he was about to push harder, a dull knock echoed from within. Daniel froze. The knock was deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone or something was on the other side, waiting. Heart pounding, he stepped back, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. The only response was silence. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. Maybe the wood had shifted under the pressure, creating an illusion of sound. But as he turned to leave, the knock came again, louder this time. That night, Daniel found it hard to sleep. The image of the cabinet lingered in his mind, its locked door a puzzle he couldn't shake. He tried to rationalize the noise, convincing himself it was nothing more than the house settling or the echo of his own movements. But the unease gnawed at him. Around 2 a.m., he was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, moving across the wooden floor of his bedroom. His breath hitched, and he lay perfectly still, his eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. The footsteps stopped. He reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling with the switch. Light flooded the room, and he sat up, scanning the space. The room was empty almost. The closet door was ajar. He was certain he'd closed it before bed. "Is someone there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. He climbed out of bed, his legs trembling as he approached the closet. Gripping the door, he yanked it open. Nothing, just his clothes hanging limply, undisturbed. For the next few days, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Shadows seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, and he often heard faint whispers when the house was otherwise silent. He tried to focus on renovating, hoping the physical labor would distract him. But every time he ventured into the basement, the cabinet drew his attention. One evening, unable to resist any longer, he decided to take another look. Armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, he descended the stairs. The basement felt colder than usual, the air heavy with dampness. As he approached the cabinet, his flashlight flickered and died. Swearing under his breath, he resorted to the dim glow of his phone. The locked door seemed to mock him, its brass keyhole glinting faintly. This time, he tried unscrewing the hinges, but the screws wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabinet had been designed to resist intrusion. Frustrated, he sat back, staring at it. That's when he noticed something he hadn't before: the carvings on the cabinet. They weren't just decorative, they told a story. Twisted, contorted figures danced across the surface, their expressions frozen in agony. At the center of the door was a single eye, carved with such precision it seemed to watch him. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They didn't just stop at his bedroom door, they circled his bed. Daniel lay paralyzed, gripping the sheets, his heart hammering in his chest. When the sound stopped, he dared to open his eyes. The room was dark, but the closet door was wide open. He couldn't take it anymore. Determined to solve the mystery of the cabinet, he decided to break it apart entirely. The next morning, he gathered tools and returned to the basement. As he raised a hammer to strike, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the single bulb that lit the space. The hammer slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. And then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper, coming from inside the cabinet. "Let me out." Daniel stumbled back, his mind racing. The voice was hoarse, barely above a growl, but it was unmistakably human. He wanted to run, to leave the house, and never return, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The cabinet began to rattle, the locked door shaking violently, as if something inside was trying to break free. Terrified, Daniel bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind him. He grabbed his phone and called the police, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain the situation. When they arrived, he led them to the basement, his hands trembling. But the cabinet was gone. The tools he'd left scattered on the floor were neatly arranged, and the basement looked undisturbed. "Are you sure, sir?" one of the officers asked, his tone skeptical. Daniel could only nod, his mouth dry. They left soon after, advising him to get some rest. That night, Daniel packed a bag. He didn't care about the house or the money he'd invested. He just wanted to leave. As he loaded his car, he glanced back at the house one last time. In the window of the master bedroom, a shadow stood motionless, watching him. He drove away, vowing never to return. But even miles away, in the safety of a motel, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being followed. The whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. And when he turned out the lights to sleep, he swore he saw the outline of the cabinet in the corner of the room. Lila's new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. She'd found the listing by chance, a small but cozy one-bedroom in an older part of town. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but she'd figured it was due to the age of the building, creaking floors, old plumbing, that sort of thing. Walls painted a dull off-white would never stay fully shut. No matter how carefully she slid them closed, no matter how many times she checked before bed, by the time she woke up, they were always open. Just a few centimeters, barely enough to notice, but enough to make her uneasy. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the building was settling, or the tracks on the doors were warped. It was old, after all. But as the nights went on, her unease grew. She started to hear faint creaks in the middle of the night, sounds that seemed to come from the closet. She'd lie in bed, her heart pounding, straining her ears to catch every sound. It was probably just the old pipes, she told herself, or maybe even the neighbors. But then there was the smell, a faint, acrid scent, like something damp and rotting. It would waft into the room without warning, lingering just long enough to make her stomach turn before disappearing again. Lila cleaned obsessively, even scrubbing the closet itself, but the smell persisted. After 2 weeks, she was at her wit's end. Sleep-deprived and jittery, she decided to take matters into her own hands. That night, she dragged a sturdy wooden chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the closet door handles. If the doors couldn't slide open, she'd finally have peace of mind. But peace was the last thing she got. She fell asleep quickly that night, exhaustion finally overpowering her anxiety. Hours later, she woke suddenly, her eyes snapping open in the pitch-black room. At first, she wasn't sure what had roused her. Then she noticed it, the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Her heart began to race as she reached for her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the closet. The doors were ajar, just as they always were. But the chair she'd wedged so firmly under the handle was now on the other side of the room, tipped onto its side. For a moment she couldn't move, her breath caught in her throat. And then she saw them. 2 glowing eyes staring out from the gap in the closet doors. They were unnaturally bright, a sickly yellow that seemed to pulse faintly in the dark. Lila froze, unable to tear her gaze away. They just stared, unrelenting, as if they were waiting for her to make the first move. Slowly, she began to inch backward, pulling the covers up to her chin, as if they could somehow protect her. The faint dragging sound started again, louder this time, and she realized with growing horror that it was coming from inside the closet. Something was moving in there. Her phone slipped from her trembling hand, the flashlight beam shifting wildly across the room. In the chaos, the light caught something else, a hand, pale, skeletal fingers curling around the edge of the closet door. They were impossibly long, the nails cracked and jagged. The hand flexed, gripping the door as if preparing to push it open further. Lila scrambled out of bed, her legs barely supporting her as she backed toward the door. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she couldn't bring herself to back on the closet. The air was thick with that same acrid smell, now so overpowering it made her eyes water. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, unanswered. And then the door moved. Slowly, deliberately, it slid open another inch. The glowing eyes disappeared, but the faint outline of a figure began to emerge. It was hunched, impossibly thin, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. It took a shuddering step forward, and the floor beneath it groaned in protest. Lila bolted. She ran out of the room, down the hall, and into the living room, slamming the door behind her. Her hands shook so violently she could barely lock it. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to call 911, but the screen was frozen, unresponsive. The faint dragging sound started again, this time from the other side of the door. Tears streamed down her face as she backed into the corner, clutching a heavy lamp like a weapon. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped entirely. The silence was deafening, broken only by her ragged breathing. Then, a whisper. Low and guttural, it came from directly behind her. "You shouldn't have locked the door." She spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The lamp slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. And then the lights went out. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the faint glow of yellow eyes, staring at her from the shadows. It started on an ordinary Tuesday night. Henry, a 10-year-old boy with a sharp imagination, had always been wary of the dark corners of his room. The shadows that the moonlight painted on the walls never settled right with him, but he chalked it up to being a kid. That night, though, something was different. He noticed the closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. He swore he had closed it before bed, as he always did. At first, he thought it was nothing. Maybe the latch hadn't caught, or maybe he had forgotten to push it fully closed. But then he felt it, an overwhelming sense that something was staring at him from the closet. He could almost hear the faintest of breaths, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. Henry froze. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the door, his imagination painting terrible things in the shadows. "Mom! Dad!" he finally managed to yell, his voice cracking with fear. Within seconds, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. His parents burst into the room, their concerned faces lit by the soft glow of the nightlight on his dresser. "What is it, honey?" his mom asked, her voice full of worry. Henry pointed at the closet, his hand trembling. "There's something in there," he whispered. "It's breathing." His dad frowned, flipping the light switch. The room flooded with brightness, and they all turned to the closet. The door was shut tight. "There's nothing there, sweetheart," his mom said gently, walking over to the closet. She opened it wide, revealing rows of hanging clothes, a few shoeboxes, and nothing else. "See? It's just your imagination." Henry shook his head violently. "No! I heard it! It was breathing, I swear!" His dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's probably those scary books you've been reading. We've told you not to read them before bed." "I didn't," Henry protested. But his parents weren't convinced. They kissed his forehead, turned off the light, and told him to go back to sleep. As soon as the door clicked shut, Henry's eyes darted back to the closet. It stayed closed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the other side. The nights that followed were no better. Each time Henry went to bed, he felt the same oppressive presence coming from the closet. Sometimes, he thought he saw movement in the shadows when the door was ajar, just a flicker of something impossibly tall and thin. The worst part was the breathing. It was always faint, but unmistakable, a slow rasp that sent chills down his spine. Henry tried everything. He pushed a chair in front of the door, wedged it shut with books, even tied the handles together with a jump rope. But no matter what he did, the door would be ajar by the time he woke up, and the feeling of being watched would return. One night, he decided to stay awake. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, he perched on his bed and kept his eyes glued to the closet. The hours ticked by, and he fought the pull of sleep with every ounce of his willpower. Around 3 a.m., when the world was at its quietest, the door creaked open. Henry's breath hitched. The darkness inside the closet seemed deeper, more alive. He could just make out a shape standing there, tall and thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was cocked to the side, as if studying him, and its eyes, "Go away." Its eyes were too. His voice wavered, but the words rang out in the silence. The figure didn't move. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its joints cracking loudly in the quiet room. Henry shone his flashlight directly at it, but the beam seemed to do nothing. The creature's form stayed shrouded in darkness, as though the light couldn't touch it. Panic set in. Henry swung the bat wildly, but the creature moved faster than he thought possible, dodging his strikes with fluid, almost serpentine movements. It let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound grating and inhuman. "What do you want?" Henry whispered, tears streaming down his face. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it pointed one long, clawed finger at him, its grin widening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Then it stepped back into the closet, its glowing eyes the last thing to disappear as the door swung shut with a soft click. Henry sat there, trembling, until the first rays of dawn seeped into his room. When he finally worked up the nerve to check the closet, he found it empty once again. But he knew better now. The creature was still there, waiting. From that night on, Henry refused to sleep in his room. His parents tried to convince him it was all in his head, but the fear was too real. They let him sleep on the couch, thinking it was just a phase. But even there, he couldn't escape the feeling that the creature was watching him, lurking just out of sight. Then came the night he woke up to find the closet door open in the living room. He didn't even have a closet there. But the same oppressive darkness spilled out, and the creature stepped into the room, its glowing eyes locked on him. This time, there was nowhere to run. It started as an innocent game on a dreary, rainy afternoon. The house was old, the kind of place that carried its age in every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind through cracked windows. A group of kids, restless from being stuck indoors, decided to play hide and seek. Among them was Sam, a boy of 10 with a streak of boldness that often got him into trouble. When it was his turn to hide, Sam wanted the perfect spot somewhere no one would think to look. The upstairs hallway had a row of old closets, their wooden doors warped and splintered. One of them, slightly ajar, caught his eye. He slipped inside, careful to close the door silently behind him. The air in the closet was musty, filled with the scent of mothballs and aged wood. Coats and dresses from another era hung limply, their shapes distorted by years of neglect. It was cramped, but Sam figured it would do. As he settled into the dark, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the house. "Ready or not, here I come," called Mia the Seeker, her voice playful but determined. Sam smirked to himself, confident in his choice of hiding spot. Minutes passed. The muffled sounds of the game filtered through the thick closet door laughter. Hurried whispers, the occasional thud of someone bumping into furniture. Then, everything went quiet. Sam held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched on, becoming oppressive. He thought he heard the faintest creak of a floorboard outside the closet. Someone was close. Then he felt a warm breath against his neck. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make every hair on his body stand on end. He froze, his mind racing. Was someone in the closet with him? Had another kid chosen the same hiding spot? "Just don't peek," he whispered, barely audible, trying to keep the game's light-hearted spirit alive despite the sudden unease creeping up his spine. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It wasn't playful or light. It was firm, solid, and cold. Sam's breath hitched as a deep, guttural voice murmured from the depths of the closet. "I'm not peeking." The words sent a chill through Sam that seemed to freeze his very soul. He bolted upright, reaching for the door handle in blind panic. His fingers scrabbled against the wood, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. Behind him, the breathing grew louder, raspy, and unnatural, filling the confined space. Sam's heart thundered in his chest as he pounded on the door, yelling for help. "Mia, anyone, let me out!" His voice echoed back at him, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The laughter and footsteps he had heard earlier were gone. The house was deathly silent. Suddenly, the closet seemed to stretch, the walls receding into an impossible void. The coats swayed as though moved by an unseen wind, their shadows dancing ominously. Sam turned, pressing his back against the door, and saw something emerge from the darkness. A figure loomed, its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. The only thing Sam could make out was its eyes black and empty, like twin voids staring into his soul. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps as he fumbled for anything he could use to defend himself. His hand closed around a metal hanger. Without thinking, he swung it wildly, the wire striking nothing but air. The figure was gone, but the voice remained. "You can't hide forever," it hissed, its tone dripping with malice. The closet door suddenly flew open, and Sam stumbled out, falling to the floor of the hallway. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around wildly. The house was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of a storm outside. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the walls. "Mia? Jake? Anybody?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response. The house felt different, almost alive. Shadows seemed to shift and writhe along the walls, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. Sam moved cautiously down the hallway, every step echoing unnaturally loud. He passed the other closets, their doors now wide open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. He felt as though he was being watched, the sensation prickling at the back of his neck. As he reached the staircase, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the stairs stood Mia, her back to him. Relief flooded through him, and he started to call out to her. But then she turned. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were black voids, just like the figure in the closet. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that split her face almost in half. "Found you?" she whispered, her voice a distorted mockery of her usual tone. Sam stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. He turned to run, but the hallway stretched before him, impossibly long. Doors that hadn't been there before now lined the walls, each one slightly ajar. Whispers emanated from them, a chorus of voices calling his name. "Sam, come here, Sam. We've been waiting." He ran, his legs pumping furiously. But no matter how far he went, the hallway seemed endless. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. He clamped his hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face. Finally, he saw a door at the end of the hall, bathed in a faint, flickering light. Desperation drove him forward. He reached the door, throwing it open and tumbling inside. He found himself back in the closet. The coats hung motionless, and the air was still. It was as if he had never left. But he wasn't alone. The figure was there, waiting for him. Its black eyes bored into his, and it reached out a hand, its fingers long and gnarled. Sam tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the voice, low and sinister. "You should have stayed hidden." Jacob had been craving solitude. City life had worn him thin, and the prospect of a quiet weekend deep in the woods was too tempting to pass up. He found a listing online for a rustic cabin miles from civilization, a Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the sound of the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. Perfect. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined, but cozy in a rugged way. It had a creaky wooden floor, a stone fireplace, and the faint, earthy smell of age. He dropped his bag by the door, made a mental note to sweep out the cobwebs later, and set to unpacking. The first night passed uneventfully. Jacob read by candlelight, lulled by the crackling of the fire and the chorus of crickets outside. The isolation was soothing, just as he'd hoped. But as the morning sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, Jacob decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. It was during this inspection that he noticed one of the floorboards in the living room was loose. Curiosity got the better of him. With a bit of effort, he pried the board up and found a leather-bound diary nestled in the hollow beneath. The leather was cracked, the edges frayed, and the pages yellowed with age. The name on the inside cover read, Miriam H. Jacob flipped through the diary's pages. The entries began innocently enough, chronicling mundane details of life in the cabin. The changing seasons, the wildlife, the solitude. But as he read on, the tone shifted. Miriam's descriptions became darker, more frantic. She wrote of footsteps echoing through the cabin at night, of whispered voices just outside the windows, of shadowy figures she could never quite catch sight of. One entry in particular made Jacob pause. The 3rd of June? I heard it again last night. The sound of someone walking upstairs. But there is no upstairs. There never was. Jacob glanced upward instinctively. The cabin's ceiling was low and solid. There wasn't even an attic. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off. It was just a story, he told himself. Miriam had probably been isolated for too long and let her imagination run wild. That night, the cabin felt different. The once comforting silence now seemed oppressive, the shadows cast by the firelight sharper and more menacing. As Jacob lay in bed, he thought he heard faint creaks in the floorboards, as if someone was walking in the next room. But when he got up to check, the cabin was empty. The next morning, Jacob's unease deepened as he read further into the diary. Miriam's entries became more erratic. She described waking up with scratches on her arms, finding objects moved from where she'd left them, and hearing her name whispered in the dead of night. One entry chilled him to the core. The 7th of July. It knows my name. I saw it today, in the mirror. It wasn't me. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That evening, as he sat by the fire, he noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls didn't move in time with the flickering flames. They seemed to have a life of their own, writhing and stretching unnaturally. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the unease gnawed at him. The third night was the worst. As Jacob lay in bed, he was jolted awake by a loud bang. Heart pounding, he grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table and crept into the living room. The loose floorboard was sticking up, as if someone had pried it open again. The diary was lying on top, open to a page he hadn't read yet. The entry was dated the 10th of July, and it described an encounter that mirrored his own. The bang, the floorboard, the flashlight. And then he saw it. His name, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Jacob, it's coming for you. A cold dread settled over him. He slammed the diary shut and threw it back under the floorboard, replacing the plank as best he could. But the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. He felt eyes on him everywhere he turned. Every creak, every rustle, every gust of wind outside made him jump. At midnight, Jacob's flashlight began to flicker. He scrambled to replace the batteries, but the beam wouldn't steady. That's when he heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the corner of the room. Slowly, he turned the beam of the flashlight in that direction. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into a shape that defied logic, impossibly thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally. Jacob backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing moved closer, its form shifting and flickering like a bad signal on a television screen. Just as it reached for him, the flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. The next thing Jacob knew, he was outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He didn't remember running out, but his legs ached as if he'd sprinted a mile. The cabin loomed behind him, its windows dark and foreboding. He clutched the diary in his hands, though he had no memory of retrieving it. Desperate for answers, he flipped to the last page. The date was today's, and the entry read, the 21st of January. It's already too late. Run. As Jacob read the final words, the cabin door creaked open behind him, though no wind stirred the trees. The shadows inside seemed to pulse, beckoning him back. And then he heard it, a whisper, clear as day, right next to his ear. Jacob, it's too late to run. The first time Nathan saw the figure outside his window, he chalked it up to exhaustion. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town, tucked deep into the shadowy embrace of the woods. It was supposed to be his retreat, a place to write, to think, to escape. But as the moonlight cast long, gnarled shadows across the clearing, Nathan couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. It began subtly. A flicker of motion caught in his peripheral vision as he hunched over his desk. He glanced up, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, there it was, a silhouette standing just outside the window, its shape warped by the old, rippled glass. Whoever it was stood unnervingly still, as though carved from the darkness itself. Nathan froze, the pen slipping from his hand. His throat tightened. For a moment, he considered calling out, but something about the figure, its stillness, its vague but undeniably human, chaperoned him to his chair. Instead, he reached for the small desk lamp and flicked it on. Instantly, the figure vanished. Not a retreat, not a hurried escape into the trees. It simply wasn't there anymore. He spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, every creak of the floorboards setting his nerves alight. By morning, the incident felt like a bad dream, a trick of the moonlight and his overactive imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, he was ready. The figure appeared shortly after sunset, as Nathan sat pretending to read. He'd left the curtains open, daring it to show itself. When it did, standing in the exact same spot, He felt the same icy dread crawl up his spine, but he forced himself to act. Clutching a flashlight, he bolted out the front door, his boots crunching against the frosty ground. The beam of light sliced through the darkness as he circled the cabin. There was no one there. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling of bushes, nothing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The woods swallowed his words, offering no reply. When he returned inside, the window was still empty, but he felt eyes on him, sharp, invisible, relentless. By the third night, Nathan couldn't ignore the pattern. The figure appeared like clockwork, always at the same window, always vanishing the moment he turned on the light. He stopped sleeping, his nights spent in a state of hyper-alertness, waiting for it to return. The strain began to wear on him. His reflection in the mirror was hollow-eyed, his hands trembling even when he held nothing. One evening, desperate for answers, he set up an old camcorder on the desk, its lens trained on the window. If the figure showed itself again, he'd finally have proof. Hours ticked by as he sat in silence, the only sounds the occasional pop of the wood stove and the wind's mournful whistle. Then it came. The figure materialized slowly this time, as though it were seeping out of the shadows. Nathan watched it through the viewfinder, his breath shallow. He resisted the urge to turn on the light, wanting the camera to capture every second. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it knew it was being watched. Suddenly, the camcorder's screen went black. Nathan's heart plummeted. He scrambled to check the device, but it wouldn't power back on. When he glanced back at the window, the figure was gone. The sense of intrusion lingered, thuff of pressure in the air, like static before a storm. The following day, Nathan played back the tape on an old television. At first, it seemed normal, the empty clearing outside the cabin, the soft glow of moonlight, and then the figure appeared. But what the tape showed wasn't what he'd seen with his own eyes. On the recording, the figure was pressed against the glass, its face pale and grotesquely stretched, its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Nathan recoiled, nearly knocking over the television. He could hear it now too, faint but unmistakable rasping, wet sound, like breathing mixed with something far more sinister. He destroyed the tape that afternoon, burning it in the wood stove until only ashes remained. But the figure didn't care. It came back that night, closer than ever. When Nathan finally turned on the light, he swore he saw the faint outline of a handprint smeared on the glass. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. The figure didn't wait for nightfall anymore. It appeared at odd hours, always at the periphery of his vision. Objects in the cabin moved on their own, books tumbling off shelves, chairs creaking as though unseen weight pressed on them. Once, as he tried to sleep, he felt a cold breath against his neck. He didn't dare turn around. By the end of the week, Nathan decided he'd had enough. He packed his belongings in a frenzy, ready to abandon the cabin for good. But as he reached the front door, he heard a slow, deliberate knock. His blood ran cold. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, as if nails were being dragged down the wood. Nathan's hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Finally, he wrenched it open. The clearing was empty. The wind hissed through the trees, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning the darkness. That's when he felt Ida hand, icy and impossibly strong, gripping his shoulder from behind. Nathan never made it out of the woods. The locals would later whisper about the cabin, about the man who'd come to escape, and was instead consumed. On certain nights, if you stand by the tree line and peer into the clearing, you might see him at the window, his silhouette warped by the old rippled glass. The rain started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a relentless downpour, drumming against the roof of the cabin with a deafening rhythm. James, a 30-something city dweller with a constant itch to escape the monotony of his desk job, had booked the cabin through a travel app that promised solitude and serenity. Nestled deep within a forest 2 hours from the nearest town, It seemed like the perfect retreat, cheap, cozy, and surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The first day had been uneventful. James spent most of it lounging on the worn-out couch, nursing a bottle of wine while flipping through a novel he'd brought along but wasn't truly interested in reading. By the time evening rolled around, the cabin's rustic charm had begun to feel more like isolation. The dim, flickering bulbs barely lit the small living space, and the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet felt unsettling. Still, he told himself it was all part of the experience. That first night, James fell asleep to the sound of rain, thinking the forest darkness was a comfortable break from the city lights and noise. But just as he began to drift off, he heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the rain. But there it was again. A deliberate, steady knock against the wall. He sat up, heart pounding. "It's probably just a branch," he muttered, trying to dismiss the sound. But when he strained his ears, he realized the knocking wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the wall. A chill crept up his spine, but he shook it off, laughing nervously. "You are just being paranoid," he told himself. "It's an old cabin. It's probably settling or something." Still, he couldn't shake the unease. He grabbed his phone and texted the cabin's owner, a woman named Margaret, who'd been polite but distant during their brief correspondence. "Hey, I am hearing some weird noises in the wall. Could it be animals?" he typed, hitting send. A response came almost immediately. "Probably raccoons or squirrels. The forest is full of them. Don't worry, they won't get inside. Just ignore it." James stared at the message, her casual reassurance doing little to calm his nerves. Still, he forced himself to relax, turning the television on to drown out the noise. The static-filled channels and crackling audio were hardly soothing, but it was better than the alternative. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell asleep on the couch, the remote slipping from his hand. The second night was worse. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest unnervingly quiet. Around midnight, the knocking began again, louder this time. James sat bolt upright, his skin prickling with fear. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was accompanied by a faint scraping, as if something was clawing at the wall. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shone it around the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Okay, maybe it is animals," he muttered, though he didn't entirely believe it. The sounds were too deliberate, too human. He texted Margaret again. "The noises are louder tonight. Are you sure it's animals?" This time her response was slower. "Yes, it's just animals. These old cabins always make weird sounds. Try not to worry." Something about her reply didn't sit right with him. The smiley face from the previous message was gone, and the tone felt more clipped. But he didn't know what else to do. He spent the rest of the night huddled under the blanket, flashlight in hand, waiting for morning. By the third night, James was on edge. The unease he'd felt before had grown into a gnawing paranoia. The knocking began earlier, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. It was no longer confined to one spot. Now it seemed to move along the walls, as if something was crawling inside. He couldn't take it anymore. Determined to get to the bottom of the noise, James grabbed a hammer from the small toolbox he'd found in a cupboard and began tapping on the walls. The sound reverberated through the cabin, but when he reached the spot where the knocking was loudest, the hollow thud beneath his hammer made him freeze. It didn't sound like the rest of the wall. It sounded off, different. Heart racing, he began prying away at the wooden paneling. It was tough work, and each nail he pulled out seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to remove a large section of the wall. Behind it was another wall, hastily constructed and poorly sealed. A chill draft seeped through the cracks, and James realized that this section of the cabin had been deliberately walled off. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stop, but curiosity got the better of him. He broke through the second wall, revealing a hidden room cloaked in darkness. The air that rushed out was thick, damp, and reeked of decay. Shining his flashlight inside, he saw a small, barren space with nothing but a wooden chair in the center. The chair faced the wall, its back to the room, and ropes dangled from the armrests as if someone had been tied to it. James stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell?" he whispered. Just as he turned to leave, the door to the room slammed shut behind him. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. And then he heard it not from the walls, but from directly behind him. A deep, guttural whisper. Finally, before James could react, cold fingers brushed against his shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through his body. He spun around, the flashlight flickering back to life just long enough to illuminate a figure twisted, emaciated, and impossibly tall. Its eyes were hollow voids, yet they seemed to bore into him with an unbearable intensity. The figure lunged, and James screamed, stumbling backward into the chair. As he hit the ground, the ropes on the armrests writhed like living things, snapping around his wrists and pinning him down. The creature loomed over him, its face inches from his own. Its breath was rancid, and its voice came again, a guttural rasp filled with malice. "You woke me. Now, you stay." James thrashed against the restraints, but the ropes only tightened. The last thing he saw before the flashlight died for good was the creature's mouth splitting into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then, the room plunged into complete darkness, and James's screams were swallowed by the silence of the forest. The next morning, the cabin stood silent and undisturbed. The walls showed no sign of being tampered with, and the hidden room was sealed once more. When Margaret arrived to prepare the cabin for the next guest, she noticed nothing out of place except for the faint, lingering smell of decay that seemed to cling to the air, no matter how wide she opened the windows. The cabin stood alone in the heart of the forest, its dark wooden exterior blending seamlessly with the towering trees that surrounded it. Emma and Ryan, a young couple eager for a weekend escape from the city, had rented the place on a whim. It was charming in its own rustic way, with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom with creaky floorboards that whispered of countless years of history. But as night fell, the forest's serenity gave way to an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against the windows. The first sign of something unusual came shortly after midnight. Emma was curled up on the couch, a book in her hands, while Ryan poked at the fireplace, trying to coax the flames higher. A faint murmur broke the quiet, so soft Emma thought she'd imagined it. "Did you hear that?" she asked, lowering her book. Ryan glanced up. "Hear what?" "A voice?" she said hesitantly. "It sounded like it was coming from under the floor." Ryan laughed, the sound a bit too loud in the otherwise silent room. "It's probably just the wind, or maybe the cabin settling. These old places make all kinds of weird noises." But Emma wasn't convinced. She sat frozen, straining to hear. And then it came again, clearer this time, a faint, whispered sound, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Ryan's smile faltered. "Okay," he said, setting down the poker. "That's weird. Maybe it's an animal." They both crouched low, their ears to the floor. The whispers were clearer now, and undeniably human. Words they couldn't quite make out floated up through the wooden planks, joined by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across a hard surface. Emma recoiled, her face pale. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. Ryan didn't answer. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the old iron ring embedded in the floor near the fireplace. It was the handle of a hatch, one they hadn't paid much attention to when they'd first arrived. Now, it seemed ominous, almost alive. "I am going to open it," Ryan said, his voice low. Emma grabbed his arm. "No, are you crazy? We don't know what's down there." "Exactly," he said, shaking her off. "We don't know, and I'd rather find out now than spend the whole night wondering." Reluctantly, Emma stepped back, her heart pounding as Ryan gripped the handle and pulled. The hatch creaked open, revealing a yawning blackness below. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the space. It was a cellar, empty save for a dirt floor littered with handprints and footprints. They were human, but oddly shaped, with fingers and toes that seemed unnaturally long. "There's nothing here," Ryan said, his voice echoing slightly. "Just prints. Maybe someone was squatting here before us." "Those aren't normal footprints," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Let's just close it and forget about it, okay?" Ryan hesitated but nodded, pulling the hatch shut. They bolted it and returned to the couch, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. But the whispers returned, louder now, their words just barely discernible. "Let us out," they seemed to say. The floorboards began to vibrate, a low, rhythmic thumping joining the voices. Emma clung to Ryan, her nails digging into his arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. Ryan grabbed his car keys, and they ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The knob refused to turn, as if some unseen force was holding it in place. The windows were the same, their glass cold and unyielding no matter how hard they pounded. The thumping grew louder, shaking the entire cabin. The hatch rattled violently, the iron ring clanging against the wood. Emma screamed as a crack split the floor, and from the darkness below, pale, elongated fingers began to emerge. Ryan grabbed the fire poker and swung at the hand, but it moved with unnatural speed, dodging the blow. More hands appeared, followed by arms and faces twisted, eyeless things with gaping mouths that emitted an unearthly wail. Emma and Ryan backed into a corner, their horror mounting as the creatures pulled themselves up and out of the hatch. "Stay back!" Ryan shouted, swinging the poker wildly. But the creatures didn't seem to notice him. They moved in unison, their heads tilting as if listening to something only they could hear. And then they spoke, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. "You woke us. You opened the way," Emma sobbed, clutching Ryan as the creatures turned toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural. The couple's screams echoed through the forest as the creatures closed in, their long fingers reaching out. When morning came, the cabin was silent. The hatch was closed, the bolts secured as if it had never been touched. A new couple arrived that afternoon, eager for a peaceful getaway. They didn't notice the faint, ghostly handprints on the floorboards, or the way the air seemed heavier inside. But as night fell, the whispers began again, soft and inviting, luring them closer to the hatch in the floor. The dense forest swallowed the fading daylight as a group of 5 teenagers trudged through the undergrowth, their flashlights flickering against the looming shadows. They'd heard the rumors, the legend of the old forest rangers who tanned, fueled by youthful bravado, decided to uncover the truth for themselves. The hut, they were told, was cursed, its walls bearing sinister inscriptions, left by a ranger who vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. "Do you think we'll find anything?" asked Mia, her voice trembling slightly. Her flashlight beam darted nervously across the gnarled trees. "Just some old junk and maybe a couple of rats?" scoffed Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group. His confidence was unwavering, even as the forest seemed to press in around them. "Yeah, or a ghost waiting to eat our faces," muttered Ethan, earning a nervous laugh from Ava and Liam. But deep down, all 5 felt the weight of an unseen presence, a suffocating tension that thickened the air with every step. Finally, they reached it. The hut stood in a small clearing, its crooked roof sagging under the weight of time. The wood was warped and blackened, as if the building had been scorched by an unseen fire. Vines snaked up its sides, clawing at the cracked windows. "Looks like it's about to fall over," Jake said, masking his unease. He pushed the creaking door open with a dramatic flourish. "After you, ladies and gentlemen." The group stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The interior was as unsettling as the exterior. Cobwebs draped every corner, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. But it was the walls that drew their attention. Words had been scrawled across them in jagged, uneven letters, as if carved by a desperate hand. "I am watching you. You are next." Mia shivered, instinctively stepping closer to Ava. "This is seriously messed up. Who would do this?" "It's probably just some old graffiti," Jake said. Though his voice lacked its usual bravado, he ran a hand over one of the carvings, the letters rough and deep. Or maybe the ranger was just a psycho. "Guys, look at this," Ethan called out. He was standing by an old dust-covered table. On it lay a tattered notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and crude drawings of faces contorted in terror. "This is like something out of a horror movie," Liam said, flipping through the pages. Did he draw these people? Were they real? Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence. A loud creak, as if someone had stepped on a loose floorboard. All five froze, their flashlights whipping toward the sound. There was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," Jake muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. As they explored further, the unsettling atmosphere only deepened. Strange symbols adorned the walls, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The group's banter grew quieter, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. Then it happened. One moment, Ethan was standing near the far wall, examining a particularly large inscription. The next, he was gone. No sound, no scream, just gone. "Ethan?" Mia's voice cracked as she spun around, her flashlight searching desperately. "This isn't funny. Where are you?" "He's messing with us," Jake said, though his hands were shaking. "He'll jump out any second, just wait." But Ethan didn't jump out. Instead, the wall where he'd been standing began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new image appeared. A drawing of Ethan's face, his eyes wide with terror, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Ava screamed, dropping her flashlight. "Oh my God, that's him! That's Ethan!" The others stared in horror, unable to look away from the grotesque likeness. It was unmistakable, the same curly hair, the same faint scar on his cheek. But it wasn't just a drawing. It felt alive, as if Ethan's essence had been trapped within the wall. "We need to get out of here," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Right now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. A low, guttural sound filled the hut, like the growl of some unseen predator. "Stay together," Jake ordered, his voice trembling. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me with this." Liam and Ava rushed to his side, pulling and pounding on the door, but it remained firmly shut. Meanwhile, Mia's flashlight caught something new on the wall. Another inscription, fresh and dripping as if it had just been carved. "Leave if you can." "We're trapped," Mia said, her eyes wide with panic. "It won't let us go." Suddenly, Liam let out a strangled cry. The group turned to see him clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Before anyone could react, he vanished just like Ethan. In his place, another drawing appeared, this one even more horrifying. It showed Liam's face, his mouth twisted in an anguished scream, tears streaming down his cheeks. The remaining three huddled together, their fear palpable. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light. The growling sound intensified, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "What does it want?" Ava whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his confidence shattered. "But we're not staying to find out. We'll break a window if we have to." But as they moved toward the nearest window, the glass darkened, as if ink was spreading across it. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller and smaller. And then Ava was gone, her scream echoing for just a moment before it was swallowed by the darkness. Her likeness appeared on the wall, her eyes pleading for help. "No, no, no," Mia sobbed, clutching Jake's arm. "We can't stay here, we have to do something." "There's nothing we can do," Jake said, his voice hollow. "It's playing with us." The growling turned to laughter deep, guttural and mocking. Jake grabbed a piece of broken wood, brandishing it like a weapon. "Come out and face me," he yelled, but the laughter only grew louder. In a final desperate act, Jake smashed the wood against the wall, shouting in defiance. The wall splintered slightly, but the darkness surged forward, engulfing him. Mia screamed as his image appeared next, his expression one of sheer agony. Now alone, Mia backed into a corner, her flashlight flickering. The laughter ceased, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. Slowly, the darkness crept toward her, tendrils reaching out like living shadows. On the wall, new words appeared. Welcome home. And then, there was only darkness.